I never planned to become a whistleblower. I didn't wake up one morning feeling brave or moral or ready to burn my career down. I was just trying to do my job and keep my head down. But the moment my director leaned back in his chair, smiled like this was all a joke, and said, "No one will believe you," something inside me went cold. At first, I thought he was right. I'd been with the company for almost 6 years, mid-level operations manager at a fast-growing logistics tech firm, not glamorous, but solid. Good salary, decent stock options, a boss who praised me in meetings and ignored me everywhere else. The kind of place where everyone talked about culture while quietly watching their own backs. What I found started small, a billing discrepancy. One client being overcharged in a way that didn't make sense. I assumed it was a software bug. Then I noticed another, and another. Same pattern. Same clients. Same internal cost center. Always rounded just enough to stay under the radar. So I did what I'd always done. I documented it. Spreadsheets. Screenshots. Timestamps. I pulled system logs I was authorized to see, compared them to invoices, traced the approvals. It took weeks. Late nights after my wife went to sleep. Coffee going cold next to my laptop while I stared at numbers that shouldn't exist. That's when I realized it wasn't a bug. It was a process. Certain enterprise clients were being quietly overbilled. The excess wasn't going to revenue. It was being routed through a consulting shell tied to one of our senior executives. Clean on paper, ugly in reality. If anyone audited deep enough, it would explode. I escalated it the right way. First, my direct manager. He skimmed the summary, went quiet, and told me to let finance handle it. Finance told me it was above their scope. Legal never replied. HR suggested I focus on my assigned KPIs. So eventually it landed on my director's desk. I still remember his office. Glass walls, minimalist art. The kind of space designed to make you feel small without trying. He let me talk for 10 minutes without interrupting, nodded, asked a couple of surface-level questions. Then he closed my folder, leaned back, and said it. "No one will believe you. Not you're wrong. Not we'll look into it. Just that." He explained it calmly, almost kindly. These were big clients, sensitive relationships, complex billing structures I probably didn't fully understand. And even if something was off, it would be my word against executives who'd been there since day one. Then he added, "If you push this, it won't end the way you think." I walked out of that office knowing two things. First, he wasn't surprised. Second, I was officially alone. That night, I didn't sleep. Not from panic, from clarity. I replayed every meeting, every brushed-off email, every forced smile. The company wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Around 2 a.m., I remembered the poster in the break room, the one everyone joked about. Ethics Hotline, anonymous, confidential, independent. I'd walked past it for years without thinking. I found the number in my inbox archive. Read the fine print. Third-party provider. Calls recorded. Claims of anonymity with legal carve-outs, spelled out in careful language. I hesitated for a long time. This wasn't a movie. Whistleblowers didn't get medals. They got managed out. But doing nothing felt worse. So I called. I didn't give my name. I stuck to facts. Explained the billing flow, the shell entity, the approvals. The woman on the line didn't react. She just asked precise questions, the kind that told me she understood exactly what I was saying. When I finished, she said, "Thank you. We'll review and follow up if needed." Then the line went dead. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. No emails, no calls, no sudden meetings. I started to wonder if my director was right. Maybe it had been logged, archived, buried under legal language and forgotten. I almost convinced myself to let it go. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I didn't know it yet, but answering that call would change the balance of power in that building forever. The woman on the phone introduced herself as a case manager from the hotline provider. Not the company, not legal. An external firm contracted to triage reports. Her voice was neutral, careful. She said my report had been flagged for follow-up and asked if I was willing to answer additional questions. I said yes before she finished the sentence. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked how the billing approvals were time-stamped, who had override authority, whether audit logs could be altered retroactively. I told her what I knew and, just as importantly, what I didn't. When she asked if I still had access to the systems, I paused. Yes, I said. For now. There was a brief silence. Then she said, "That may not last." After that call, everything at work felt louder. Emails sounded sharper. Meetings dragged with attention I couldn't explain. I started noticing how often my director's name came up in conversations that had nothing to do with him. How finance suddenly wanted process reviews. How legal scheduled closed-door sessions with executives and told no one why. I didn't change my behavior. That was a conscious decision. I still showed up early, still hit my metrics, still contributed in meetings, but I stopped improvising. Everything I did was documented, time-stamped, backed up off-network, not out of paranoia, out of pattern recognition. By Monday, my calendar invite came. "Quick sync," my director wrote. No agenda. I walked into his office and knew instantly this wasn't quick. HR was already there, seated too neatly, hands folded like this was rehearsed. My director smiled again. Same smile as before. Friendly. Controlled. He said they'd received concerns about my performance. Not results? Performance? Tone? Judgment. Boundary issues, he called them. Apparently, I'd been overstepping by involving myself in areas outside my remit. I asked if this had anything to do with the billing discrepancies I raised. HR looked at my director. He looked back at her. Then he said that matter was reviewed and closed. I asked by whom. He said, appropriately. That was the moment I understood the rules had shifted. They didn't fire me. That would have been too loud. Instead, they reassigned 2 of my core responsibilities, moved one of my direct reports to another team, asked me to start copying my director on all external emails for alignment. When I pushed back, calmly, HR reminded me that cooperation was part of my role. I went back to my desk and found my system access unchanged, but narrower. Certain reports I used weekly were suddenly restricted. Nothing dramatic, just enough friction to slow me down. That evening, the hotline called again. Same woman, same tone. She told me they'd requested internal documentation from the company and received partial compliance. I asked what that meant. She said, "They're being selective." She asked if I'd experienced any retaliation. I laughed before I could stop myself, not because it was funny, because it was obvious. I told her everything. The meeting, the access changes, the language HR used. She listened, then said, "Please document all of it. Dates, names, exact wording." I asked her if this was going anywhere. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "It is, but slowly, and they know something's coming." The next week was worse. A senior VP I'd never interacted with joined one of my standing meetings and spent the entire time asking questions that had nothing to do with the agenda. Afterward, my director messaged me privately and said I needed to be more careful about how I present information. No examples, no guidance, just the warning. I started getting excluded from conversations I'd previously led. Decisions were made without me, then handed down as fate's accomplice. When I asked for context, I was told it was handled. At home, my wife noticed I was quieter. I didn't tell her everything, just that work was unstable. She asked if I'd done something wrong. I told her no, and I meant it. One night, close to midnight, I logged into my personal email and saw a forwarded message I didn't remember sending. It was a calendar export. Mine. From my work account. Sent to an internal legal distribution list I wasn't part of. They weren't just closing ranks. They were building a case. I didn't know it yet, but they'd already made a decision about me. They were just deciding how cleanly they could execute it. I stopped trying to prove I was right. That sounds backward, but it's the moment everything changed. Up until then, I'd been operating under the assumption that if I just stayed factual, professional, reasonable, someone would step in. That the system, flawed as it was, would eventually correct itself. It wouldn't. What I saw instead was a coordinated effort to isolate me without triggering anything that looked like retaliation on paper. Meetings without invites, decisions logged after the fact, tasks reassigned verbally, never in writing. It was subtle enough that if you described it out loud, it sounded paranoid, but patterns don't lie. I started keeping a private timeline. Not emotional notes, just facts. Date, time, who said what, exact phrasing, when access changed, when responsibilities shifted. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I wrote it like a deposition transcript because I had a growing suspicion this would one day be read like one. Then came the performance memo. It was framed as informal feedback, delivered by HR with my director present. No accusations, just concern. They said I seemed distracted, that my communication style had become overly rigid, that I was struggling to adapt to evolving priorities. I asked for examples. They gave me none. I asked if my output metrics had changed. They admitted they hadn't. The meeting ended with a suggestion. Maybe I should take a few personal days. Reset. Reflect. That was the first time I felt something crack. Not fear. Anger. Controlled. Focused anger. The kind that doesn't lash out, but starts planning. That night, I reread my original Hotline report. I compared it to what had happened since, and for the first time, I stopped asking whether I'd misread the situation. I hadn't. The next morning, I received a system notification. My access to historical billing data had been revoked due to role realignment. No discussion, no warning. But it didn't matter anymore, because I already had what I needed. Months earlier, when I'd first started investigating, I'd exported comparative reports to validate a reconciliation issue. That export was standard procedure. Allowed, logged. I'd saved it to a personal encrypted drive at home, intending to clean it up later. I never deleted it. I cross-checked those files against the partial documentation the hotline had described. The gaps lined up perfectly. Same missing date ranges. Same clients. Same shell entity. They weren't fixing the issue. They were erasing it. The hotline called again 2 days later. This time the tone was different, less procedural, more deliberate. She asked me very carefully whether I believed internal management was acting in good faith. I said no. She asked if I was willing to submit supporting documentation through a secure channel, understanding it might escalate the matter beyond the company. I asked what beyond meant. She said, regulatory review. I didn't answer right away. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, long after my wife went to bed, laptop closed, just thinking about the mortgage, about my reputation, about how easily this could follow me if it went sideways. And then I thought about my director's smile, the certainty in his voice when he said no one would believe me. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about truth versus lies. It was about records versus narratives. And I had records. I emailed the case manager the next morning and told her I was in. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. The shift happened quietly, then all at once. After I submitted the files through the secure channel, the hotline stopped calling. No updates. No reassurance. Just silence. The heavy kind that means things have moved out of your hands. At work, the pressure eased in a way that was somehow worse. My director stopped scheduling check-ins. HR went radio silent. Access didn't come back, but it didn't shrink further either. It was like they'd put me in a box and decided to wait. I kept showing up, kept documenting, kept my mouth shut. 2 weeks later, the first crack appeared. A senior finance manager resigned without a farewell email. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how fast his name disappeared from internal systems. Org charts updated overnight. Slack history locked. People noticed but didn't ask questions. Then legal showed up. Not the in-house team. Outside counsel, expensive suits, temporary badges. They booked conference rooms for policy reviews and stayed behind closed doors all day. My director suddenly started looking tired. Meetings ran long, deadlines slipped. No one said anything to me. But people started watching me differently, not with suspicion, with distance. Like proximity itself had become risky. On a Tuesday morning, my director finally called me in. No HR this time, just him. He didn't sit behind his desk. He stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out at the parking lot, like he was buying time. When he spoke, his voice had lost its confidence. He said there were questions about my earlier concerns. That legal wanted to understand my perspective. That cooperation would be appreciated. I asked if this was still considered closed. He didn't answer. The meeting with legal happened the next day. 2 attorneys, one took notes, the other asked questions that tracked exactly with the documents I'd submitted. Same time frames, same shell entity, same approval chain. They weren't fishing. They were confirming. I answered carefully. Precisely. I didn't speculate. I didn't accuse. I just described systems, processes, and what I personally observed. When they asked why I hadn't escalated sooner, I told them the truth. I had, internally, and had been told to stop. They asked by whom. I told them. After that, everything accelerated. Calendar invites vanished. Meetings canceled midday. Executives flew in without explanation. Finance froze discretionary spending. The CEO sent a company-wide email about external compliance reviews and full cooperation. My director stopped making eye contact. One afternoon, my access badge failed at the door. Not permanently, just long enough to make a point. AITA fixed it within minutes, but the message was clear. The ground was unstable, and everyone could feel it. The real fallout came a week later. An internal announcement went out stating that my director was stepping away effective immediately. No details, no goodbye. His projects reassigned, his calendar wiped. By the end of the day, 3 more names followed. Finance, compliance, a VP whose signature I recognized from the approval logs. People whispered. Slack channels went quiet. The office felt hollowed out, like a building after a fire where everything looks intact but smells wrong. HR finally reached out to me, not to discipline, but to check in. They asked how I was handling the stress, offered support resources, mentioned the importance of confidentiality. I told them I was fine, and I was, because for the first time in months, I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't fighting narratives. The truth had momentum now, and it didn't need me to push. The last conversation I had with the Hotline case manager was brief. She told me the matter had been referred externally, that protections were in place, that retaliation would be monitored. Then she said, "You did the right thing." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt emptied out, like something heavy I'd been carrying had finally been set down. But the chaos wasn't over yet. It was just no longer aimed at me. The day my director's name disappeared from the org chart, I went home at a normal hour for the first time in months. Not early, just normal. I sat in traffic, cooked dinner with my wife, answered questions I'd been dodging. I didn't give her every detail, but I told her enough. About the billing, about the hotline, about how close I'd come to losing everything. She listened without interrupting, then said something simple that stuck with me. So they tried to scare you quiet, and it didn't work. That was the first time I allowed myself to see it that way. Work didn't magically become peaceful. Investigations rarely feel clean while they're happening. There were interviews, follow-ups, requests for clarification that came weeks apart. Then suddenly, all at once, external auditors, regulators whose names I recognized only after Googling them. Everything slow, deliberate, procedural, but something important had changed. No one questioned my credibility anymore. HR stopped framing conversations around alignment and started talking about support. Legal copied me on emails I never would have seen before. My access wasn't fully restored, but it didn't need to be. I wasn't chasing proof now. I was answering questions, and the questions were coming from the right places. A month later, the company announced a strategic restructuring. That's what they called it. Investors were informed. Certain business units were dissolved. A consulting relationship was terminated by mutual agreement. No public accusations, no dramatic press releases, just consequences. One afternoon, I received a calendar invite titled Status Update. It was from an executive 2 levels above my former director, someone I'd met once, briefly in passing. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. He thanked me for my professionalism, said the company was reviewing internal processes, and that my role was secure. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This was over. Not long after that, my director's LinkedIn updated, open to new opportunities. Comments disabled. I didn't feel satisfaction in the way people imagine. There was no victory speech moment, no dramatic closure. What I felt instead was relief, the quiet kind that settles in slowly, like your shoulders dropping after you realize you've been clenching them for months. The hotline called one last time. The case manager told me the review had concluded, that findings had been substantiated, that protections would remain in place, but active monitoring was no longer necessary. Before we hung up, she said something I hadn't expected. Most people don't follow through, she said. They stop when it gets uncomfortable. I asked her what happened to those people. They usually leave, she said, or they stay quiet. After everything was done, I thought a lot about that first meeting in the glass office, about the confidence in my director's voice when he told me no one would believe me. He wasn't wrong about the risk. He just underestimated the math. Truth doesn't need volume. It needs structure. I stayed at the company for another year, long enough to see new compliance systems put in place, long enough to watch people start asking better questions in meetings. Then I left, on my terms, for a role somewhere quieter. Sometimes I still see that poster in break rooms. The ethics hotline, the same generic language, the same fine print, and I know how easy it is to walk past it. I also know what happens when you don't. This isn't a story about heroism. I didn't expose corruption with a speech, or bring anyone down with a single bold move. I just documented what I saw, refused to be bullied into silence, and understood that credibility is built long before you need it. When my director said no one would believe me, he was counting on fear. What he forgot was paper trails don't get scared, and neither do people who've already decided they can live without his approval.